Hello. As is often the case, I'm in a strange mood again, so I've decided to turn to another Mr. Men book in search of some semblance of wholeness. I don't actually. That was a bad intro, but we're too far into the take. I don't know why I keep doing this. However, this is, I guess, what I do now when I have 20 minutes to kill and I'm in a strange mood. Is I just read a Mr. Men book. Um, this one was chosen mostly by random. I went through a few by random, and I was like, none of these seem apparently great. And then I did one final round, and I was like, this will be the one, and it was Mr. Worry, and I was like, why not? I don't know how much worse it can be than Mr. Nobody, because boy, that was a mess of themes. That was a mess. It's a mess. It's like when Green Book wins Best Picture, and everybody says it's representation. It's not. As my dear friend Emmy put it, it is a yellow savior book. So I think that we should strip Mr. Happy of all rights. We'll eventually read his. This is a bad intro. We'll read his side of the story eventually. I'm gonna start reading before things get worse. Mr. Worry by Roger Hargrave. If you will take a note of his appearance, he does not have a discernible mouth. Wow, that's really harsh lighting. He does have two eyes relatively close together. Please focus. He's got some lines on his head and he's got a fat red nose. Oh my goodness, this is already going poorly. Poor Mr. Worry. Whatever happened, he worried about it. If it rained. Why am I laughing? It's not funny. If it rained, he worried that his roof was going to leak. This is him outside in the rain and he's worrying. It's really unfortunate that it's unable to detect the darker shades in Mr. Worry's appearance, for they add so much nuance. Anyways, it's raining outside, and you can see Mr. Worry is obviously worrying. Surprise. With like Mr. Small and Mr. Nobody, at least Mr. Small, it was a physical trait that it described. It didn't actually talk about his personality. Mr. Worry is a personality trait. And Mr. Nobody, I guess, was kind of both, because he was physically a nobody, but also internally felt like one. So this is kind of a personality approach. So that's great. If it didn't rain, he worried that all the plants in his garden were going to die. I don't know if he's heard of a watering can. He just looks like a blob, I guess. I guess it's like that. So Mr. Worry struggles to make joy of any circumstance. In his life, he always sees the negative of something and fears the worst. Well, maybe not the worst. I don't know if his flowers dying is the worst possible case scenario, but we'll see. If he set off shopping, he worried that the shops would be closed when he got there. And when the shops weren't closed when he got there, he was worried that he was spending too much money shopping. He was spending too much. No, I'm fine. I read it correctly. I'm not having a good time with this. He actually looks relatively at peace here, but I guess that's because he doesn't have a mouth. I'm sorry, that just registered how funny it was what I just said. He looks quite at peace here because he doesn't have a mouth. What it would be like to not have a mouth, that I cannot spew dumb stuff all 24 hours of the day. He's worrying about shopping. It's a bit of exposition. We're getting into a routine, so I imagine it'll be like Chekhov's gun eventually. That's not what it's called. Or like if you put a gun on the wall in the first act, it has to be shot by the third. I don't think that's happening. This is just exposition or character development. That's not at all. I'm gonna keep reading and shut up. And when he got home with his shopping, he worried that he'd left something behind, or that something had fallen out of his basket on the way home. So Mr. Worry just struggles with being content in any moment. He's walking home on the red brick road. He's actually he's going through Mount Doom. It's actually molten lava on the ground. It's quite the trek. I'm not funny. Yeah, Mr. Worry is worrying. Do with that information what you will. And when he got home and discovered that he hadn't left anything behind and that nothing had fallen out of his basket on the way home, he worried that he'd bought too much. And then he worried about where to put it all. Life was just one long worry for poor Mr. Worry. So even when it seems that his worries are solved by logic and reason, he still finds something to worry about in his situation. Which is just an unfortunate perspective. I think today might be the things change for Mr. Worry, though. One day he went for a walk. He was worried that he might walk too far and not be able to get home, but on the other hand, he was worried that if he didn't walk far enough, he wouldn't get enough exercise. He hurried along worrying. Or could you say he worried along hurrying? He met Mr. Bump. "I'm very worried about you," he said. At least his worry is somewhat, concerning. No, I mean, like, he has concern for others, and that's part of the worry. Mr. Bump probably needs that in his life, considering how accident prone he is, and he tends to, bump. "Why's that?" asked Mr. Bump. "I'm worried that one of these days you might hurt yourself," he said. "Don't you worry your head about that," replied Mr. Bump, and went off, tripping on his own feet. Mr. Worry went on. Mr. Bump is tripping up. He's struggling. But he tells him not to worry. "Do not worry about me." Mr. Bump clearly has lived how many days, how many years, how many eons? Do the Mr. Men age? Are they born as they are? Are they children? Anyways, Mr. Bump's clearly fine. He's still alive, so he's probably fine. He met Mr. Noisy. "I'm very worried about you," he said. "Why's that?" asked Mr. Noisy. "I'm worried that you might lose your voice," said Mr. Worry. "Don't you worry your head about that," said Mr. Noisy, and went off. Clump, clump, clump. And Mr. Worry went on. Here's Mr. Noisy. He's got big shoes, big mouth, all the things. He's a very foreboding presence, and you see Mr. Worry cowering. But he still has worry for him. Mr. Worry's concerned for all the people he meets in his life, which isn't necessarily unhealthy, but when taken to a point of obsession and unreasonability, then that's where the problem begins, and I would say in Mr. Worry's case, it's already there. He met Mr. Greedy. "I'm very worried about you," he said. "Why's that?" asked Mr. Greedy. "I'm worried that you might eat too much and be sick," explained Mr. Worry. "Me," replied Mr. Greedy. "Eat too much. Impossible." And went off for lunch. Mr. Worry went on. So Mr. Worry does give reasoning for his worries at each of these Mr. Men. However, they are merely founded in... There's nothing to bring about this concern other than their existence. Like, Mr. Noisy talks a lot, so of course he's going to be worried that he might lose his voice, but that's... It's not like, oh, Mr. Worry just screamed 18 eons worth of... He just screamed an entire Shakespeare play. I think he might lose his voice. It's just Mr. Worry's going about his life. There's no incident specifically that's going to incited. Oh, look who's back. He met a wizard. Hello, said the wizard. Who are you? I'm Mr. Worry. And look it. And look it, commented the wizard. Tell you what, he went on, for he was a helpful sort of wizard. Why don't you go home and write down every single thing that you're worried about, and I'll make sure that none of these things ever happen. So, wizards are a form of deus ex machina in the Mr. Men, it seems, or just really bad plot devices. The arcane never ends well. I don't think Mr. Worry can compose a list of all his worries as well, so I feel like Mr. Worry will die before that happens. But, let's see. He smiled. Then you won't have anything to worry about, will you? Mr. Worry smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled in a long time. In fact, it was the first time he'd smiled that year. He hurried home in great excitement. So Mr. Worry clearly buys into this, that the wizard can erase all his worries. I mean, believe what you must, but I think that the worrying is more of a psychological issue. When he got home, he sat down to write out all the things that worried him. Every single thing. It was a long list. Then he went to bed and had the best night's sleep he'd had in years. He is smiling. He does have a mouth. I guess just writing them out was enough to give him some semblance of peace, because he has the wizard's promise technically, but nothing has been done about them yet. So I'm surprised he's not more worried. Like, what if it doesn't actually work? I'm kind of actually surprised at that. It seems to be contradictory to Mr. Worry's character, but I guess he wanted somebody to say that instead of just the thing. He didn't want somebody to say, oh, you don't have to worry about me. He wanted someone to say, you don't have to worry about anything. Who knows? The following morning, the wizard came around to collect Mr. Worry's list. My goodness me, he said when he saw the size of it. However, he said, leave it to me. I'll go off and make sure that none of these things ever happen. And off he went. Nothing to worry about now, he called over his shoulder. Nothing at all. Mr. Worry heaved a sigh of relief. So it's a very long list. However, I'm kind of shocked that Mr. Worry actually composed a list of everything that worried him. I assume he would have had to go through basically everything that he does on a day, because it seems that he lives in a constant state of panic. It's a very long list. I'm actually surprised. I would have assumed it was infinite, but clearly it's a finite list of worries from Mr. Worry, but they're all just so consuming. That day was the first day in Mr. Worry's life that he didn't have a single thing to worry about. And the next day after, the day after that, and the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Mr. Worry didn't have a care in the world. But clearly something is not going as it seems. Mr. Worry's he seems elated at this point. Seems very elated. On Monday morning, he was a worried man. Oh dear. What do you think was causing him to worry? Nope. What do you think was worrying him? Can you guess? He went to see the wizard. Oh dear, said the wizard when he saw him standing on his doorstep. What's worrying you? I'll tell you, said Mr. Worry. I'm worried because I don't have anything to worry about. And he went home. I'm worried because I don't have anything to worry about, and he went home to worry about not having anything to worry about. Here's the last picture. It's just Mr. Worry on a very small page. This has made a mockery of his character. You've made a mockery of him. Or maybe this is his true character and he can never be content and he's just trapped. I don't think the wizard did anything. I bet it was just psychological for Mr. Worry to write everything out. I believe that the wizard actually did nothing, and that it was purely a psychological exercise for when Mr. Worry was told he didn't have anything to worry about, he just didn't worry. So it's clearly a psychological ailment on Mr. Worry's part. And the wizard didn't actually have to do anything arcane. He may have pretended to for peace of mind of Mr. Worry. And clearly the people of Mr. Land, or wherever the hell these take place, put value in the arcane because they turn to it so frequently. However, in reality, I mean, in Mr. Nobody's case, it turned him yellow. But in this case, I believe that the wizard didn't actually do anything. And it was merely a psychological exercise to assist Mr. Worry in realizing that his worries were irrational. I imagine that he has some irrational worries, but I think we all do. But instead of having a healthy level of worry, Mr. Worry goes carefree because he believes the wizard has done some arcane ritual to make him worry-free. However, he gets trapped by his own hubris, and he worries about not having anything to worry about because that is so central to his core, that he feels like he's no longer himself if he cannot worry, despite it being a negative attribute, or at least a generally negative attribute. Worrying so heavily, he still feels like it gives him purpose and meaning because that's so foundational to his character and who he is. And instead of him coming to terms with that, we made a mockery of him so that children can laugh at the end of his story. This is a tragedy. This is right up here with Shakespeare in the tragedy department. You would think it would have a happy ending, and I mean, I guess to some accounts it does, but no. Mr. Worry is trapped by this narrow-minded view of the world and seeing it only through the lens of fear. And despite him supposedly escaping that, it's so foundational to him that it's the only thing that he truly knows, so he relies back on it once he's had a week of freedom, for he no longer knows what to do with himself. I guess that's it. I wasn't expecting it to be quite this sad. Well, thanks for joining me, I guess. These always make me feel something, at least, so that's good. Maybe we'll try it. Maybe the next one will be a bit better. You know, I can say this was better than Mr. Nobody to some degree, at least, because this had a bit more complexity to the character, and I mean, even though it made a mockery of him at the end. I think that Mr. Nobody is just history being told from the wrong perspective. And at least this is somewhat of a think piece on how we confine ourselves as individuals and how we view the world through a lens of fear. And we live in a constant fear of something, whether it be death, tomorrow, people, we live in fear to some degree. And the freedom is found in letting go of it. Thank you for joining me.